Hello everyone, my name is Miles Steele, and in this video I'm going to be covering the first chapter from Robert Sayers and Ralph Rinzler's publication, The Korean Onggi Potter. If you study ceramics, it's likely that at some point you will encounter these names if you haven't already. Robert Sayers is a ceramics historian who wrote a series of publications with the Smithsonian Museum in the 1980s about ceramics from all over the world. And Ralph Rinzler is a Smithsonian curator who co-authored all of those publications. But other than that, there isn't much written about these two scholars, and there isn't much else to say about them. The Onggi Potter is actually quite a big paper, and it's very densely packed with information. So for this video, I'm just going to be covering the first chapter where Sayers goes over the general history of Onggi pottery in Korea, and he lays out some key points for consideration. Firstly, he states that Onggi pottery is poorly studied due to its being very pedestrian in function and typically being undecorated, although sometimes Onggi pots would have simple abstract decorations. Onggi pottery is also greatly overshadowed in the world of art history by luxury ceramics like expensive Celadon vessels. The second point is that Onggi pottery should be studied despite this. And finally, that Onggi should be studied because it plays an integral role in Korean history, culture, and the life of the Korean everyman. To support his statement, Sayers divides the first chapter into 5 sections to cover the important parts of Onggi and its history. He starts with a short section describing what Onggi is, what it's for, and includes some descriptions and writing from Western explorers and missionaries, as well as Korean scholars from various periods. The next section covers the social and economic relationship between the artisans who made Onggi and the merchants who sold it. The third section covers the punwan, or the kilns run by the Korean royal court. The fourth section is about Onggi and its important relationship with Catholicism in Korea. And the final section discusses the influences and contributions of Japanese culture to Onggi. But before I get ahead of myself here, I'm going to lay out some terms and definitions that I'm going to be using later that are going to be helpful to know. So first is Pubosong. They're a social class consisting of Pusong and Posong peddlers. They were considered low class, more like middle class, but they did have a lot of power because they had so much control over the flow of goods. There's the Yongban, who are tax-exempt hereditary nobles. They held titles, they were landowners. There's the Songmin. They were a traditional class of tenant farmers and landowners. They later became associated with any kind of entrepreneur. The Chonmen are lower class. They're like an outcast class. Anyone who works with raw materials sort of falls into this class as well. Sham, is the word for workshop, and punwan refers to the royal porcelain kilns. But this word wasn't used to describe them until after they relocated from Seoul. So, Onggi, what are they? Well, Onggi are large earthenware vessels used for food storage. They can range in size from a foot or two high to large enough to fit a person inside. Until the latter half of the 20th century, Onggi pottery was completely ubiquitous within Korea. It was used for storage in every household on the peninsula, rich and poor, and They were produced entirely by rural artisans in small, sometimes family-owned workshops. Typically, onggi pots are used to store pickled vegetables, cereal liquors, sauces, and any other foods that require preservation or that you would like to have in large quantities. According to the Korean intellectual So Gu, in his 1834 publication, 16 Discourses on Rural Economy, onggi pots could hold anywhere from 22.5 to 75 liters, and the name onggi is derived from the Chinese ong, which are small containers for drawing water, but they can also be large vats used for distilling. He also details the process by which onggi are sealed. In the summer, onggi are sealed with a wooden lid and a rain screen of oiled or lacquered paper, followed by bamboo leaves to keep out rain and insects. During the winter, onggi are blanketed in thick mats made of rice stalks, and then they're buried in the ground for insulation. Just as important as the pots themselves are the people who made and sold them. During the feudal period, Korean society was rigidly divided into tiered classes with little to no social mobility at all. The highest class was the Yongbon. Below them was the Songmin, with the Chonmin at the bottom. Merchants and artisans did not explicitly fit into any of these social classes. However, Sayers proposes that Confucianism can help provide some clues as to how merchants and artisans were treated. During the Yi period, Confucianism was adopted as the state religion in Korea, and even before then, Confucian ethics helped shape Korean social strata. Because Confucianism places more value on those who work with their minds and casts out those who labor with their hands, we can reasonably assume that merchants were probably treated similarly to songmen because of their social power from controlling the flow of goods and because their profession didn't involve physical labor. On the flip side, however, artisans likely got lumped in with the chonmin thanks to their involvement with raw materials and manual labor. They probably were not treated very well socially. But in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, things changed after Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasions of Korea left the government desperate to pay off its mounting debts by selling titles and exemptions from military service to the Songmin, as well as enlisting large amounts of chonmin into the military and minting standardized coinage. These economic endeavors led to more social mobility and the rise of rural marketplaces, making onggi potters and merchants the deciding factor in the decline of the Korean feudal state. Here in the section about the Punwan, Sayers takes some time to discuss the living and working conditions of luxury porcelain makers and how their conditions compare to onggi potters. During the 15th century, at the end of the Yi period, the Punwan relocated from Seoul to Gwangju County in Gyeonggi province in order to have easier access to kaolin and timber used for making their porcelain and firing their kilns. The Punwan would rotate to different locations roughly every 10 years in order to avoid completely exhausting local resources. After each move, the Punwan would then press local artisans and farmers into part-time service. Understandably so, these local workers are very unhappy with this arrangement as it cut into the time they would be usually using to grow food for their families and to sell. Artisans also found that they made more money staying at home on their private workshops rather than going to work at the Punwan like they were supposed to. During this time, the Punwan suffered setback after setback from strikes over poor living conditions. Squatters were using up timber at the locations that they would move to, and the Japanese invasions put a lot of stress on production. The Punwan even saw a lot of its craftsmen starve to death because they were only paid in bolts of cloth and their work at the kiln left them little to no time to grow their own food. The Punwan were eventually saved from destroying itself, however, after the government rolled back some of its strict quality control restrictions, allowing the Punwan to avoid throwing out most of its wares that it produced. However, in 1883, the Punwan found itself in decline again, and it was sold into private ownership. At the end of this section, Sayers contrasts the Punwan with the Onggi potters, who had a much easier life. Despite having slim profit margins, Onggi potters and Onggi pottery was judged solely on practical use, meaning as long as the pot could be sealed, it could be sold, allowing Onggi potters to sustain themselves consistently, even in times of economic downturn. Another important aspect of Onggi pottery is its close relationship with Catholicism in Korea. The spread of Catholicism in Korea is very interesting, as it is mostly the result of Korean scholarship rather than the work of foreign missionaries. Actually, the West had very little to do with the spread and even the introduction of Catholicism in Korea. In 1777, a group of Songmin called the Sirhak, who were fed up with the way Neo-Confucianism was affecting their country, retreated to a temple to study works of Christian theology, which they found attractive due to its egalitarian ethics. In 1783, one of the Sirhak was baptized a Catholic in Peking and returned to then baptize the rest of the Sirhak. The group then set out to evangelize. Over the years, opposition within the Korean court turned to violence, and Christianity was heavily persecuted in Korea until it adopted religious freedom in a treaty with France in 1886. During its time of persecution, however, Christianity found great popularity among artisans who, like the Sirhak, were attracted to its egalitarianism. Onggi pottery also helped Christians stay hidden, as mobility was their best tool for survival at this time. And Onggi pottery allowed them to pack up and move whenever they wanted, under the pretense that they were seeking better firewood and clay, or seeking a better place to sell their wares. The final section is a few paragraphs on how the Japanese contributed to the study of Onggi. Sayers quickly covers the interactions between Onggi pottery and Japanese scholarship in the early 20th century. Following the Japanese occupation of Korea, the Japanese government sponsored a lot of publications on Korean ceramics. These papers were, of course, very biased, but they're still incredibly informative and thorough. These publications tell us that in the 1920s, Korea lacked any sort of professional ceramics industry at all. And all kilns within Korea, all ceramics workshops, were owned by small families. They were just family-run businesses. And these family-owned kilns were recorded all across Korea. They were all over the place, and that's all they had at the time. And they carried on the Onggi tradition, but because Onggi pots lacked the apparent artistic sophistication of luxury Korean ceramics, the Japanese considered them unworthy of study and did not go any further with their scholarship. The Onggi potter is an incredibly dense and cluttered paper. It feels more like an information overload at times than a paper with a concise point to make, but that does mean it is full of incredibly interesting and important information. There's so much stuff that was not entirely relevant to Sayers' point, and so much stuff that I just do not have the time to talk about in this video. But it is an incredibly informative and a ridiculously thorough paper. If I were to rewrite the Onggi potter, I would definitely try to cut down on some of the peripheral information, try to make it a little more of a concise read. But for what it's worth, I think the Onggi Pottery is a fantastic publication that does a great job showing off the value and the importance of Onggi pottery. Thank you for watching.